Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. August 1528. In the blazing heat and crushing humidity of the Florida summer, Alva Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca works on building a wooden raft. He is hundreds of miles from his home in Castile. Hungry, tired, dehydrated, unarmed, and demoralized, he now works on a desperate plan to somehow make it out of here alive. His expedition, under the command of Conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez, left Spain over a year ago, with 600 men aboard 5 large ships. They traversed the Atlantic, but hurricanes, desertion, illness, starvation, shipwrecks, and battle have depleted their number to just 250 and left them without any ships. Stranded now on the west coast of Florida, their only hope for survival is to reach Spanish Mexico, across 900 miles of open water. Traversing the Gulf will not be easy, but these men have no choice. So they chop down trees to make logs for rafts, tying them together with horsehair and vines, or fastening them together with nails and tools they made by melting down their guns, swords, and armor. They tore their shirts and stitched them together to make sails, and have built a fleet of 5 log rafts. Alva Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca now faces an exhausting battle for survival. He boards his raft, says a quick prayer, and pushes off into the Gulf of Mexico. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larish. Pat, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing good. You're in a new space.
I am. So I might sound a little bit different, but, we're being joined by a guest, right?
Yes, we have a special guest today. He's a guy that I've been friends with for a long time. We are joined today by Erik Slader. Erik is the creator of Epik Fails, the website. He's the host of the podcast. He's also the author of the Epik Fails books, along with me. We co-authored them together.
That's right.
And Erik is working on a bunch of other stuff. So Erik, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ben. This is awesome. But yeah, Ben and I, we go way back at this point. We've done a few different projects together. But yeah, like you said, the Epik Fails book series, we collaborated on those. It was a great time. We did a lot of cool stuff with that series. We did like the Smithsonian signings and, did that cross-country book tour. It was crazy.
It was really fun. Yeah. So awesome. We did, the Epik Fails came out, I don't remember what year now, maybe 5-6 years ago or something. But
was it 2017?
I think
or 2018,
so.
Somewhere in there. Oh
yeah,
man,
we had done.
I should know this.
We did 4 books in the series, and
that's right.
It was pretty cool because we had written a book about the Wright brothers, and we wrote one about the space program, and then we got invited to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum to do a reading there, and it was really cool because we were signing books like across the hall from the actual the reproduction of the Wright machine and the actual door to Apollo 11 or something.
it was an incredible experience, man. Yeah.
So Erik, you do other stuff too. You don't just do Epik Fails. You're working on a few other things.
That's right. I'm always juggling several projects. It's just how I am. I can't help myself, but I've got a few different podcasts. The Super Switch Club, a Nintendo podcast, Podcasters Assemble, a movie podcast. And then I'm working on a new one right now with my wife called Nerdiogram, an Enneagram podcast. So I'm a little bit all over the place, but I like to stay busy. And of course, still doing the writing thing whenever I can.
Yeah. I was on Podcasters Assemble. We watched every James Bond movie in order.
That's right. That was a challenge.
That was work.
There's some good stuff in there, but it was a lot.
It was a lot. It took like a year and a half or something, right?
Yeah, it went for a while. But yeah, we had a fun time with it.
Definitely.
But yeah, with the Epic Fails thing, Epic Fails of History, that's Epic with a K. I started out the blog, and I was a fan of Ben's stuff at the time, and I reached out to him, and that's kind of how we met initially. But the whole concept was kind of funny. It was kind of the antithesis of what you were working on, whereas like you were covering all like the greatest heroes of history. I was like doing the opposite.
Great disasters from history.
I was kind of focusing in on some of the biggest failures of history and what we can learn from them. Everyone makes mistakes, of course, but it's important to learn from those mistakes, and the same goes for history. So. Yeah.
And there are some good lessons to learn there, right? Everybody does make mistakes, and you can't give up because,
right.
I think our first book was the Wright brothers, and the Wright brothers like had the first real plane crash before they had the first real plane flight,
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. I loved how with that series, we kind of focused in on the failures that kind of led to success. So, like the early days of NASA and all that. And of course, with what we'd be talking about today, the age of exploration, we found some interesting stories in there, that we'll be getting into one of them.
Yeah, that's right. So we were doing a book on the discovery of the New World, the age of exploration, and kind of starting with Leif Erikson and going up to more modern explorations. We did Captain Cook, Pat. We talked about Captain Cook a little bit in our Kamehameha episode. You found this story, and I was thinking like, oh, we're doing guests on Badass of the Week now. I wanted to have you come on and talk about somebody from our series, and This was maybe my favorite story of the entire series, like the most wildest story of all of them. And you kind of came. Yes. And so this was kind of a chapter that you did all the research on it. You wrote it. I did a little bit of editing on it, but not much. And so we are going to talk about a Spanish explorer of the New World named Alva Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca. And Erik, how did you come across this story?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I was trying to remember myself. As we were prepping for the books, I kind of immersed myself in research. I remember going to the library and getting like a huge stack of books on this subject, just the age of exploration in general. There's a lot there. And we ended up, I remember we had all these subjects picked out, and we went way over word count at one point, and they were like, look, we got to cut some of these guys. So like a few things didn't quite end up in there, but this was one that I kind of fought for because I was like, no, this guy's awesome. And no one knows about him. It's one of those, not no one, but he's a lesser known historical figure. So
lesser known explorer from Spanish history. And when you hear like conquistadors, people kind of like, they get a little bit, I don't know if we want to talk about that.
Yeah, I'll be honest, Ben, when you told me Cabeza de Vaca was going to be the subject of today's episode, and I said, who's he? And he said, oh, he's a conquistador. Yeah, I had that reaction.
Yeah.
So I was interested to find out where this was going to go.
Yes. And Pat,
it's understandable.
Cabeza de Vaca, does that mean the cow's head, the head of a cow?
I think so.
It seems like that, right?
I'm a little rusty on my Spanish, and I do apologize ahead of time that I'll do my best with the pronunciation, but I've never been great at that part of it. But
that's what we have. That's Pat's forte. I should just have her pronounce all of the foreign language words on the podcast because I butcher them, but she can do them all.
Anyway, and there are many resources on the internet, and said resources on the internet confirm that yes, indeed, Cabeza de Vaca does mean cow head.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
So I don't know what the story is behind that, but there you go.
Well, I assume it's probably like there's certain English last names where like the origin of it, it's like Smith is like because they were blacksmiths and things like that. So maybe his family had herded cattle or something.
Could be that. Could be the a place.
That's
right?
true.
Some of those places have those weird names, like it kind of looks like the shape of a cow's head when you draw it on a map. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll call it that. You run into that a lot with the naming of things in the New World because I think they just ran out of ideas. Like, I was trying to look up Mount Rainier is the big mountain in, near Seattle. And I remember being like, oh, I wonder who Rainier was. And it was just some guy on George Vancouver's ship George Vancouver was sailing up the West Coast, and he just started, by the time he got to Seattle, he was just naming stuff after guys on his ship. He's like, that's Big Mountain, Rainier, it's after you now.
Wow.
So, I mean, Peter Rainier was a different guy. He was like a little bit higher up, but like a lot of the smaller areas were named after just guys on his boat. Hey, you want to have this thing named after you? I got no other ideas. This one's called Cow's Head. This one's called Cabeza de Vaca. This is, John Smith Cove.
So this guy's name is like the least interesting thing about him because he's got a whole story.
He does. So,
yes,
we are going to get into this story about this conquistador. And it's not a story of a conquistador doing conquistador conquest types of things. It's a survival story.
Absolutely. It's got quite a few twists to it as well.
Yeah.
And what I really love about this story is it's a great example of Murphy's Law in action. Anything that can go wrong will, and in fact does in this story.
That's right. So kind of the primer, we're going to have to take a really quick break for a commercial, but the primer on this story for Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca is a fleet set sail to do conquistador things in 1527 with 600 men aboard. And 9 years later, Cabeza de Vaca is one of 4 survivors who gets his way to Mexico and to freedom or safety. So this is going to be a wild story. And after this break...
Strap in, y'all.
Yes, after this break, Eric is going to tell it to us. So stick with us. All right, welcome back to the show. We are here with Erik Slader, co-author of the Epik Fails series and host of the Epik Fails podcast. And Erik, why don't you kind of give us the background on Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca?
Sure. So just as a heads up, there's going to be a lot of unfortunatelys and luckilys throughout this telling. It's quite a saga. It really goes places. So Cabeza de Vaca, he was the royal treasurer on this expedition, right? And it all started in 1527 when King Charles of Spain ordered an expedition to colonize Florida. This was after Ponce de Leon. And it basically was kind of picking up where he left off, right? Now, there was a Spanish fleet put together, 5 ships, crew of 600. They set sail across the Atlantic Ocean. And after a long, grueling voyage across the Atlantic, they reached Hispaniola, where 140 crew members decided to stay behind in the Caribbean. Those were the lucky ones, as it turns out.
Oh.
Good call.
Yeah.
Just immediately left. Immediately like, oh,
yeah,
no,
they were like, okay, I'm
nice.
done. I'm out.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to think this is, 1500s, 16th century, right? Like, sailing back then was not fun, right? I think in the British Navy, they once described it as like being in jail with the possibility of drowning. Like you're on these ships, these wooden ships for like months on end at some points, so like your food's going bad and, you haven't seen, it just sounds awful, honestly.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so this is only like 30 years after Columbus. So this is a pretty new, the Atlantic crossing is a pretty new thing, pretty new technology.
Exactly. A lot of ships didn't make it. This is, it was just treacherous getting across the ocean. But that's just the start of the story.
Right. Yeah. The sail from Spain to Hispaniola is kind of the prologue.
Exactly. Sort of, setting the stage for what's to come.
Yes. And so these guys are headed to Florida, which is where you're from and where I'm from, which is kind of cool. I like all the Florida history stuff. And you said they're kind of following up from Ponce de Leon. So Ponce de Leon had been there before. And what I mostly know about him was that he was wandering around looking for the Fountain of Youth.
I mean, that's the short version of the story. I feel like that's probably a little bit apocryphal, if I'm not mistaken. There's probably, maybe that was like a side quest of his, but I don't think it was like the primary mission. And to my knowledge, Florida, the name comes from like the land of flowers. There was a lot of like pretty flowers and stuff when they landed and stuff. So
yeah. And so this expedition is going back to explore it more because we have maybe a little bit of it drawn on the map, but we want to see what else is there. See if there's something more than just a swamp here.
Exactly. I don't think they really had a good sense of the land. I don't know if they, they were still kind of figuring it out. The map was a little fuzzy still. So they were just kind of trying to establish a footing there because they had sent expeditions before, but this was an attempt to make like a more permanent establishment. So Charles of Spain, he put Governor Panfilo de Narvaez in charge of the crew. He was leading the expedition. He has a little bit of a history with, what was it? Cortez, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yep. Hernando Cortez.
Yeah, they were, I think they didn't like each other. He was going to go on the Cortez expedition, and then like they were mad at each other, and he ended up here.
Yes. Yeah, there was a lot of drama. A lot of drama between a lot of these Spanish conquistadors because they were kind of out for glory. They were looking for treasure. They just wanted to put their name in the history books, basically. And Narvaez was one of these guys. He was leading the charge.
And he does put his name in history, but not in the way that he was hopeful for.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. A little bit less lucky than Cortez. Although, yeah, that's a whole other story.
So Alvar Nuñez, he is on this expedition. So he doesn't stay behind in Hispaniola. He moves on with Narvaez to Florida.
Yeah. So from there, they first sailed to Cuba, right? And that's where they run into some weather. What started as some light rain soon turned into a torrential downpour. And eventually they found themselves huddling in for a full-blown hurricane. Now, the Spaniards were not very familiar with hurricanes. This was kind of their first taste of it. Apparently, the local Taianos I think that's where the word hurricane comes from. It's from them. So they kind of had to explain, it was actually Cabeza de Vaca himself wanted to stay on the boat. And they were like, no, trust us. You want to come to shore. And it's a good thing he did because they lost I want to say 2 ships during that storm. Wow. And it looks like at least 60 men. So it was a bad one, That's
a wild thing, right? Because people, growing up in Florida, people say, oh, what's it like to live in Florida? It's probably pretty scary because you have hurricanes. And I'm like, the hurricanes is not a big deal. You know about them like a week in advance. So you can put the shutters up. You can leave town if you need to. Like if it's going to be real bad.
If it's like a category 5 coming your way, then you definitely want to get out of there.
Yeah, just get out of there. Otherwise, you can get some water, put the shutters up, get extra batteries, that kind of thing. Not a big deal. But for this expedition, they don't have any advance warning of it. It's just like, hey, you're in a hurricane now.
Meteorology was not really a thing at this point.
Yes.
It's just like, oh, it's raining now. Oh, it's storming now. Oh, my house is blowing away now. So it was like,
Yeah, you can just pull out the app and check the radar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in Florida, we like to say there's 2 seasons, summer and hurricane season, because it's pretty much about the same all year long.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Just a little bit of heat and humidity. But anyways, so once the storm died down, it was a bit of a setback, but Narvaez, he was still determined to make the best out of the situation. And after hearing rumors of riches, they actually decided to set sail for Rio de las Palmas in Mexico. So they changed their plan. They were going to go to Florida, and they're like, nah, let's go here instead. Unfortunately, thanks to a completely inexperienced navigator named Diego Morello, they ended up 900 miles off course on the wrong side of the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, no. Oh.
In Florida. Tampa Bay, to be exact.
So they were supposed to explore Florida. They're leaving Cuba. They're supposed to go to Florida. They decide, no, there's money in Mexico. So they're going to sail across to Mexico, and then they just end up in Tampa.
Yes.
That's a pretty wild miscalculation.
Now, what's worse is they didn't realize that. They thought it's really crazy to think about, but Morello, he had convinced Narvaez that Rios de las Palmas could not have been more than maybe 30 miles north of them, when in actuality, it was about 1,000 miles southwest.
But the river they're looking for is on the east coast, and they're on the west coast. So they're on the wrong side of it's the wrong coast. They're facing the completely wrong direction. That's 90 miles north of here, but isn't it supposed to run west? And to the west of us, there's just ocean.
It's worth pointing out, Cabeza de Vaca himself actually voiced his concerns at this point. I think he kind of realized something was up. This guy is like a little too confident, and clearly we're lost, you know? But he decided to go with it anyways.
Cabeza de Vaca wrote his story down, and that's where a lot of this comes from, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of it was his account from after the fact. Okay. So, you know, this is his retelling of it. You know, so if certain detail, you know, it's one of those things. It's like, you know, this was his recounting of like a 10-year-long journey, you know. So it's one of those that like historians have kind of like gone back and tried to kind of figure out some things, I think. Mm-hmm. But
it helps when you're like one of the only survivors. You could be like, I told them they was the wrong place.
Right.
I knew right away.
Yeah. So we're just going to have to take this guy's word for it.
And we're here for good stories.
Yes, that's
exactly.
Right. Pat has a good thing about that where she says that, you know, the history is the story. Even, you know, whatever story is being told, that's the beauty of history.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, until other evidence comes up, this is what happened.
That is the history, yeah.
And you're totally allowed to be skeptical. You're totally allowed to think critically about it. And you can also just enjoy the story.
Yep,
that's right.
Without a doubt. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so they're in Tampa Bay, and they think they're in Mexico. And they've lost they've lost 2 or 3
They have no
ships.
frame of reference, to be fair.
They've lost half their horses. They've lost a decent portion of their guys, whether to storm or desertion. I mean, and maybe those deserters are starting to look. I mean, you said they were the smartest guys to get off, but like, you know, I was thinking like they land in the Dominican and they're like, oh, this is awesome. Let's stay here. This is great. But maybe those long weeks aboard the ship sailing from Spain gave them the impression that maybe they weren't under competent leadership. We're like, my best odds for survival are to abandon ship here and find a new captain.
That's a really good point. And as kind of a side tangent, something we also talked about in that same book, Columbus almost got mutinied because, you know, his crew was running out of food when they were past the point of no return before they saw land. And so, you know, this is a thing that happened. Like, you know, just because you're captain doesn't mean you're going to be in charge forever, you know?
Yeah. They did that to Henry Hudson too. They put him on a boat. He was like, I think we're close to the Northwest Passage. They're like, nope, you go on this raft, you find it yourself. We're out of here.
No confidence.
Okay, so now what? Now what do you do?
At this point, these guys were kind of in bad shape, right? But they were still optimistic that they could make this work. They could still salvage this thing. They were down to just 42 of their 80 horses, and about half of their crew decided to sail back at this point. But Cabeza de Vaca, Narvaez, and a few other guys, I think about 250 Spaniards, decided to stay behind, and they were going to try to, set up shop here, right? Mm-hmm. So they start trudging through the swamp, and they're immediately attacked by natives.
Okay.
Because, I mean, they're trespassing.
Yeah, it's like, we discovered this new land, but then it turns out that, like, somebody else already discovered it, like, hundreds of years ago, and they don't want you here.
Yeah. And at some point, after a few encounters, they realize they've made a terrible mistake. So they decide to set up camp at Apalachee Bay, and they're hoping for a rescue party that never comes. Cabeza de Vaca and the remaining survivors are then forced to eat their own horses to avoid starvation, which is that's pretty low, you know. Yeah, that's pretty
Plus,
grisly.
like, not only do you not want to eat the horse, but like the horse is important to you. Like, that's your travel. That's
it's
like
your
an easy
mode
way
of
out
transportation.
Of here.
And they were already low on
like
them.
Eating your car.
It's it went from bad to worse.
It's like stripping your car for parts, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the stranded crew eventually they decide to make a desperate plan to try to make it across the Gulf of Mexico. And this is where it gets really interesting. They melted down their guns into tools like nails, whatever they needed. And they somehow managed to MacGyver together 5 makeshift rafts out of logs, horsehair, and these sails that they sewed together with their own shirts, which is a pretty impressive feat, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So we've got how many guys? 200 something?
At this point, there's about 250, but that's, you know, according to,
Okay. So
guy,
they have sailed all the way across the Atlantic. They've landed in Hispaniola. They've dealt with a mutiny. They've survived a hurricane, a couple other serious storms. They end up 900 miles off course. Then their fearless leader takes an expedition into the swamp and never returns. And so now these guys are on the shore.
Yes.
They're like, you know, and their only hope for survival is to get to a Spanish settlement, and the closest one is in Mexico, because there is nobody's coming to get you, right? And nobody knows you're there. You're not where you're supposed to be. There's not an Uber you can call that'll take you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
And so
GPS has yet to be invented.
Yes. So they are down to a quarter of their men. They have to eat their horses, so they have no transportation. They melt down their guns, so they have no defense.
No defense.
They build rafts out of logs and their shirts, so they're not even wearing shirts.
They don't even have protection for the sun, which is that alone sounds rough, because as far as I'm aware, sunscreen was not a thing at this point.
I mean, maybe if it occurred to you to smear mud on yourself,
right?
But my guess is they might not be doing that.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so we have to take a really quick break. And when we come back, these guys are going to load up these rafts with everything they've got left, and they're going to set sail and try to navigate their way back across the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so stick with us. We'll get to that in a sec. All right, welcome back to the show. We are here with Erik Slader, the author of Epik Fails. And Erik, when we last saw our intrepid hero, he was in a real bad spot.
Yeah, that's right. This was what started out as a pretty optimistic expedition that quickly turned into a fight for survival. Not exactly, a Floridian vacation here, you know.
I always think about that. So I might have already mentioned this on the show, but there is when you read about the old explorers, the conquistadors, the pirates, the Captain Cook, those kind of guys who were sailing around exploring things, they talk about the places they've been to, but they very rarely say like how beautiful it is in Tahiti or in Hawaii or in Florida or in the Dominican or whatever. They don't say like, oh, it was beautiful, like these clear blue waters, these white sand beaches. And I think it's because that wasn't beautiful to them at the time. That didn't make them think of colorful drinks with umbrellas sticking out of them. It was death. Nothing lives in that color water. Nothing lives on that color of sand, right? You have no food and water. You are going to die if you're in this area for too long.
Right. They were a little bit more focused on other things, you know. It wasn't about leisure. It was about where's my next meal and who's hiding in those woods and why are there arrows being fired at us? Like,
yes, can I eat this, or is it made out of gold, or is it going to kill me?
Exactly. That was their whole concern. That was their world at that point. So you got to kind of put that into perspective. So at this point, again, you know, these guys are just they're surviving. You know, they're cast away. They have no hope of rescue, and so they're going to try to make it work. You know, they're putting these rafts together, and they're going to try to sail across the Gulf of Mexico on these dinky little rafts. And over the next few months, they made their way along the Gulf Coast, staying pretty close to the coast so they don't get, you know, lost forever. They ended up sailing about 750 miles, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Past Alabama, or what is now Alabama, what is now Mississippi, past Louisiana, towards what we now call Texas. And they were in pretty rough shape at this point. You know, probably a little bit on the hungry side. That might be kind of an understatement. From what I understand, they were dying of dehydration, which is pretty serious because, salt
you can't
water.
carry the water with you on those rafts. There's not enough, like you're on an old dinky raft getting blown around.
Yeah. Thankfully, they were kind of rescued by the Mississippi River. The downside, however, is that unfortunately it pushed their flotilla further out to sea where they all became separated, which is no bueno.
No bueno. Yeah.
And that's when they were hit by, you guessed it, another hurricane. And of all things, again, the worst case scenario has happened here. So,
oh my God,
at least a hurricane is bringing you fresh water,
right?
You can
trying to find a silver lining.
That's right. You gotta stay optimistic despite how bad it looks. Like that's the only way you're getting out of this. You're like, well, yeah, there's fresh water.
Yeah, but it's coming down in a way that's probably not. Yeah,
it feels like bullets.
Might not have a way to collect it.
It feels like bullets, but at least we have it. No, yeah.
If only I had a shirt to catch some of this water in.
Yeah.
Okay, so the flotilla was already pretty separated.
Yeah.
And then the hurricane comes.
Right.
And okay. Now you said this is a Murphy's Law story, so
absolutely. And it's just getting started, kind of. It's not over yet.
Oh no.
Well, yeah, we are like we're maybe halfway through telling the story, but in the context of this story, he left like 1 year ago now. He's like 1 year into the journey, and it's going to take him 9.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So Narvaez, the original commander of the crew, he ends up disappearing in the storm, never to be seen again. His whole raft is lost, gets blown away, and when all is said and done, there's only 2 of the 5 rafts left. And both end up washing up on the shore on opposite ends of this island right off the coast of Galveston, Texas. So Cabeza de Vaca is one of these survivors. Of the original colonists that made this journey, we're now down to 80. So 80 crew members left out of 600. It's pretty dire.
Yeah.
So Cabeza de Vaca, all these other guys, they're crawling up onto the shore like, just, when will it end? But thankfully at this point,
God has forsaken us.
The sun's shining, so they're doing their best, to keep going, right? The castaways, they ended up huddling around a campfire, and they end up eating the last of the rations as winter starts to set in. That's when they found themselves surrounded by a nomadic tribe of Native Americans. Luckily, the tribe took them in, giving them shelter, feeding them, clothing them. The downside is that they then realized they were now being held captive by them. So the natives of the Texan coast from what I understand, they were kind of baffled at these Europeans and their total lack of survival skills. Like, man, these guys can't fish. They can't hunt. What are you doing?
I'm really good at navigating the ocean using the stars. Is that useful to us?
And you got to remember, Cabeza de Vaca himself was a treasurer. His skills
that's right.
are
He's an economist
at this point.
Yes.
So, yeah.
What kind of returns are you getting on your investment? I think I can help.
So, they're in a bad situation, but it could be worse. They do have shelter, and that's about it. So the remaining castaways, they end up working as slave labor for this nomadic tribe. And by the following spring, less than 20 were left, according, again, to Cabeza de Vaca's record. Now,
just couldn't survive the winter. They didn't have cold weather gear. They're probably getting a lot of hard work. Yeah. Already sick and dehydrated. And
I'm sure these guys were
recover from that.
In pretty bad shape as it was. It was just like with the Pilgrims and, the Mayflower Pilgrims. A lot of them were in bad shape when they got there. So, So Cabeza de Vaca, he eventually manages to escape, and he runs into a slightly friendlier tribe, From there, he gradually learns their language and customs, and he manages to actually become a neutral trader between exchanging goods between these warring tribes, right?
Oh.
So he actually, like, which is pretty spectacular in itself, because there's that language barrier and, you know, all that. But
this is the secret to Pat's heart, is that, oh yeah, and he spoke multiple languages.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
I think that, yeah, this is one of those things that, like, everything to this point was interesting, but that right there really makes it, like, fascinating. Like that, like trying to put yourself in the shoes of someone in that situation, and they're able to navigate that, you know, and that's incredible. Props, you know. That is,
and I don't know
awesome.
the difference between, like, I can't imagine that the structure of the languages was similar, right? Like,
right.
It's not like
not Latin based.
This tribe was extremely isolated, living on an island. I imagine there was not a lot of, like, Spanish language influence. There were no shared words, you know?
Yeah,
I think that's safe to assume. Except maybe hurricane. No, wait, no, that's in a completely different part of the Caribbean.
That's a different tribe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So he figures it out, and he uses it for, it sounds like, peaceful purposes, not adversarial purposes.
That's exactly right. He ends up, you know, becoming a crucial member of this tribe. And he would later refer to each of these people, because I guess he didn't quite know what they called themselves, but he would refer to them as the Roots people, the Fish people, and the Blackberry people, based on what they primarily ate. And that's how he kind of, like, distinguished the different groups. So,
and he made it work as a trader. So he did make that treasury skill pay off for him.
Yes. I mean, you know, diplomacy is diplomacy, right? You know?
Yeah.
That's right.
It was around 1532 when Cabeza de Vaca reunited with the last remaining survivors of this completely disastrous expedition. There was Andreas Durantes, hopefully I'm saying these right, Alonso del Castillo, and del Castillo Maldonado, and an African slave called Esteban. So it was these four guys, and they kind of had they decided to kind of group together, and they decided to venture off on their own into the unknown. And the four of them became the first European explorers to make it this far into the interior of North America. They passed through Texas, into New Mexico, and eventually Arizona, where they crisscrossed the Rio Grande. Now, unfortunately, they were once again captured by natives.
Oh.
God damn it.
This time it was the Karankawa Indians.
5 years they've been on this. 5 years, and they've been enslaved by this tribe, or trying to make a living with this tribe, and then, you know, are on this island. They finally make a plan to escape. They sail away. They get captured. They cross Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona on foot or by raft, presumably, or canoe or something. And
that makes sense.
And then they're captured again.
Yes. So kind of back in the same situation all over again.
And you said that the guy named Esteban, you described him as an African slave. Do we know if they continue to treat him as an enslaved person, or did he kind of de facto achieve some sort of equality with them because they were all in this adventure together? Like, do we know that, or can we?
That's a great question that I don't necessarily have the answer to.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, you'd like to assume that they maybe have, you know, a little bit more equality at this point because of the situation they're all in.
Because they're all enslaved peoples now. So
yeah.
I mean, on the Netflix series of this, you'd want that scene.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Okay, so these four guys are traveling around, exploring around, and the Karankawa show up, or they encounter the Karankawa.
That's right. And you know, they ended up, you know, being captured by them, I guess. I can't really think of another term for it.
If that's what happens.
Shouldn't have melted those guns
down. However, there is a silver lining to this one. Over the next couple years, Cabeza de Vaca manages to earn their respect and admiration. And he ends up becoming a medicine man in the tribe. And he helps to heal their sick. So,
wow.
You know, it's, again, like he is able to cross these boundaries, you know,
Yeah.
And really like kind of see the humanity in the other side, and they're able to kind of respect him as well. And I just really love that. It's amazing that this hasn't been turned into a movie yet. You know,
it's very very unconquistador of him.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of travel around all of these interesting people and then arrive there unarmed and then kind of befriend them and become part of the civilization and this or society,
Right.
integrate into society before moving on to the next adventure.
Exactly.
Wow.
So although they didn't have their weapons, that may have been the best possible scenario. Like if they had their weapons, conflict immediately, and they probably would have been overwhelmed. And
yeah, you shoot that gun one time and you're going to be pumped full of arrows, and that's the end of your story.
Exactly. So as awful as the circumstances seem, in a way, at least for these 4 survivors, it kind of worked out.
Hey, they're making the best of it. They're in a really bad spot, and they're probably convinced they're never going to see home again.
Right.
But
absolutely,
kind of making the best of it.
And you got to, sometimes, people end up in bad situations. And one of the keys to surviving is to not giving up and to, finding the best in the situation, Gotta try to stay positive,
Yeah, and that's got to be the only thing that kept these guys going for at some points, right?
For sure.
Yeah. And I'm impressed by the fact that Cabeza de Vaca becomes a medicine man. Like, there's nothing really in his prior resume that would have predicted this.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I would assume that maybe he had some kind of medical knowledge, just like basic medical knowledge,
what we would call first aid or something.
First aid, yeah, exactly.
Home remedies. Yeah.
So
and people figure out that he's good at paying attention and picking up things. So
yeah. I mean, you would think so. It seems that way.
It sounds like it. Yeah.
Definitely. So finally, in 1536, this is a full 9 years after they first departed, a Spanish expedition comes across Castillo, Dorantes, Esteban, and Cabeza de Vaca wandering around the Mexican desert. And I wish I was there. I wish I could really describe what this was like, but I imagine that they were a bit shook by this, like a little confused, like, what are you guys doing? Where did you come from?
4 guys wandering around in the wilderness.
Exactly.
You walk up to him, we're like, is this like some kind of divine? Is this some religious thing that's happening? What's going on? And then they just start talking to you in Spanish. No, I'm from Barcelona, man.
I like to think this is like Burning Man before Burning Man, Cabeza de Vaca has this big beard, completely suntanned, I would imagine. He doesn't look anything like he did when he left. And yeah, so that's pretty much the end of his journey, at least. But what I love about this guy's story is that this is a man that went off in search of treasure as a conquistador and returned as a humbled medicine man. And it's because of this unique perspective that he got through his travels, living among the natives, he ended up earning like a newfound respect for them, because you have to remember that wasn't how the Spanish viewed these cultures. They weren't concerned about like preserving their culture or getting along with them. Even they only cared about gold, about setting up shop, about it was a very very different time, obviously.
Yeah, build a town, build a church, set up a gold mine.
Exactly.
And, deal with any problems as they arise, and a lot of the people that lived in these areas were lumped in with the problems.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of times the tribes would just be seen as a problem in the way. And Cabeza de Vaca, this changed him. Because of this journey, he spent the rest of his life advocating for the rights of Native Americans, way before that was a thing. He was way ahead of his time, and he was speaking out against the inhumane actions of other conquistadors like Cortez with the Aztecs and Pizarro with the Inca.
They were extremely violent. And, they were conquest and destroy and kill and burn and steal, do whatever you can do to get get what you want. And it's interesting that he had been kind of enslaved by these people and captured by them, and at some points, like, adversarial to the tribes that he encountered. But then to come back and then to be very vocal about advocating for, hey, we need to make peace with the people that live here. We need to treat them with respect. That's really interesting, and I think it's super cool.
Yeah, definitely, and badass.
Yes, badass. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just surviving this. All four of those guys lived.
Yeah, exactly. They did. Yeah. And, I think it's a great story about perseverance in the face of insane odds, just of not giving up, no matter how dark things get, of not losing hope. And I think that's something that we all need to hear sometimes. Like, if you really put things in perspective, at your lowest moment, was it ever this bad? So there's always things can always get better. You just got to stick with it, And my favorite line from our book on this, from our chapter on him, is the last one in that chapter. Although Cabeza de Vaca failed in his search of conquest, it seems he gained something far more valuable in his struggle for survival: compassion.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that was wow, Erik, thank you for coming on and telling us that story. That is Alvar Nuñez, Cabeza de Vaca. And yeah, I love what you said. That's kind of the vibe for Epik Fails. This is such a fun story too, with all the twists and turns.
It really is.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, like, Hollywood, call us, Yes, we'll write it.
Hollywood, call us. Well, Erik, thank you so much for coming on and telling us the story of Alvar Nuñez, Cabeza de Vaca. That was a wild story with a lot of really fun twists and turns. And it just keeps getting weirder, like you said.
Yeah, definitely. No, thanks for having me on, Ben. This is awesome. I love the podcast, and
yeah. We would love to have you come back on at some point in the future. We've got 4 books worth of material to mine, plus all of the other stuff, or maybe we'll have you on to watch another Bond movie.
Maybe.
All right.
We'll see.
Erik, where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, well, you can, follow me all over social media at Erik Slader. That's Erik with a K, Slader with the D, D as in Delta. And you can help support both Ben and I by picking up our Epik Fails book series.
That's
available at your, at a bookstore near you, Audible, Amazon, all over the place. They're a fun time.
All right.
Even though they're, geared towards a younger audience. I've gotten a lot of compliments from adults, the parents and teachers that read them too. And they're like, oh, these are really fun. So.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it too. They are for like a middle grade audience, but they're blast. So I really had a good time working on them, and
definitely
you guys are gonna have a good time reading them if you pick them up. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you guys so much, as always, for listening. We always appreciate having you here. And if you do like the show, please do leave a like and subscribe, because it does help the show out, and share it with your friends. All right, thank you so much. That's all we have for today, and we will see you on the next one.
Stay badass.
Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.